So I work in a fast food place, and my shift manager is a dick most of the time. Tonight he told me to pump out all the oil in the fryers out to the bad oil tank, which we normally do on Sundays. However, yesterday, I picked up an extra shift, and while we were slow, the general manager told me to dump the weak old oil and put new oil in. So when dickhead manager told me to do it the following night, he was telling me to dump fresh oil that was meant to be used for a week. After he told me to dump it, I turned around and started to tell him it was brand new oil, but he cut me off and said, "I don't want any fucking excuses. If I tell you to do something, you better goddamn do it." So I immediately dumped all the oil, close to $300 worth of oil, and once it's dumped into the tank, you cannot get it back. I asked him what oil I am supposed to replace it with, and when he saw there wasn't any, he flipped out. At first he thought my GM hadn't ordered any, but then I told him that we just dumped that week's oil. He asked me why the fuck I would do that, so I repeated what he snapped at me earlier, minus the childish cursing. He stormed off, so I took out my cell and called our GM and explained what happened before my shift manager could call and make something up. Which turned out to be a good idea, because he tried to tell my GM that I dumped it when he told me not to. My GM came into the restaurant and her and dickhead boss went into the office. Now he's been written up, and she took away any possibility of him getting his quarterly bonus in a couple months. And I feel kinda like a dick for dumping the oil when I knew what the outcome would be. I didn't know he'd get written up and lose his bonus. So this is actually a story that my mom told me from when she was in 8th grade. Sorry for the length. She had this art teacher, we'll call her Mrs. X, who absolutely hated her. She was an older lady with only 1 year left before retirement. This will be important later. My mom had PE right before her art class, and she also has really bad asthma. She had left her inhaler in her locker, and when she was let out late of gym, she decided to go straight to art, drop off her backpack, and then ask to go grab her inhaler from her locker. Mrs. X, having hated my mom for some time, told her to wait until announcements were over and then she could leave. She decided not to fight and to go wait for announcements. My mom's friends were ticked and they knew she had terrible asthma, so they were trying to convince her to just leave the classroom because Mrs. X didn't deserve her attention, being the witch she was. My mom said no and waited patiently until she was allowed to leave. Once the announcements were over, she went to Mrs. X asking if she could finally leave. Her response was, "Well, if you had enough oxygen to sit there and talk to your friends rather than listening, then I don't think you need your inhaler." At this point my mom is wheezing and had started to get a headache from not being able to breathe. But again, she listens to her teacher, not wanting to get further on her bad side, and waits for class to end before she can grab her inhaler. Her friends continue telling her to just leave since she isn't doing any work anyway, but she tells them to just wait, knowing full well how her body reacts to asthma attacks. At the end of class, her friends booked it with my mom's locker combination to grab her inhaler because my mom was in no shape to run. However, when they finally brought it to her, she couldn't take in enough air for the inhaler to be of any help. Her friends rushed her to the nurse's office where they told her about Mrs. X and how my mom couldn't breathe. The nurse ended up having to call an ambulance. My mom was rushed to the hospital, admitted into the ICU, almost had to get intubated, and was there for 10 days. Her parents were furious and my grandfather was ready to sue the entire state. The school, knowing that Mrs. X was only a year away from retirement and not wanting to take away the benefits she earned from staying, ended up striking a deal with my grandparents. My mom no longer had to take art, even though it was a required class for 8th grade, so she aided for the counselors that period. The school district was also in charge of paying for my mom's medical bills. My grandparents wanted her to lose her job, but agreed to the terms. But the story doesn't end there. My mom's brother, who was in 7th grade at the time of the incident, had to take sculpting the next year with Mrs. X, her last year. A few weeks into the class, my grandparents got a letter informing them that my uncle was failing art. When confronted, he told them that on the first day of school, he had asked Mrs. X a question and she had accused him of being disrespectful. As punishment, she made him sit in a room that branched off from the main classroom. Every day afterwards, she would falsely accuse him of something and force him to sit in that room where he couldn't get any work done, hence why he was failing. My grandmother called up the school district in a rage, telling them that the original agreement was now off because Mrs. X was unfairly taking out her rage on my uncle and that they were ready to sue. Because the school district never thought to get my grandparents to sign a contract saying they wouldn't sue, they were forced to fire Mrs. X, much to the delight of my mother. She never got the benefits from retirement. In France, schools have what we call païens, literally pawns. They're usually young adults, sometimes UNI students, who look after the kids and do many menial tasks around the school. One day, a new pawn was hired and her first day included looking over the cafeteria. She obviously felt like asserting her authority over us kids because she was screaming at any kid who did anything while we waited in line for the cafeteria doors to open, and she told all of them to stay behind after lunch for a punishment. One kid coughed? Punished. One kid talked with her friend? Punished. Another was scribbling in a notebook? Punished. Me? I was rocking back and forth slightly, shifting my weight from my heels to my toes mindlessly. Of course, she told me to stay after lunch too. After lunch, she took out some cleaning equipment and told all of us, there were about 15-20 punished kids, to clean all of the cafeteria, which should have been her and the kitchen staff's job. All the other kids kept their heads down and started cleaning, but I didn't. I simply refused. And I told her she didn't have the right to give us such an order as a simple pawn. She condescendingly told me if you'd read the rules of the school, you'd know physical tasks can be dished out to disobedient brats. As it turned out, I had the booklets with the rules in my bag and, following her advice, I started looking for that rule. Surprise! There was really such a rule. Except that, to be able to order that a kid do a physical task as punishment, all the teachers, the principal, the entire governing board of the school and the rector d'academy, a high-ranking representative of the Ministry of Education, must be physically present to approve of it. No way a pawn can dish that out on a whim. I told her as much, as she screamed at me to obey, or she'd drag my ass to the principal's office. She certainly meant that as some terrifying threat, but I complied. Without needed her to drag it anywhere, my ass went straight to the principal's office with the pawn in tow, trying to threaten and discourage me. I barged into the principal's office, explained the situation, and the principal initially tried to convince me to obey, even if it wasn't technically legal for the pawn to punish me. But as I insisted and told him I'd sooner sue the school than obey a stupid pawn on a power trip, the principal sighed and told me to forget the punishment and just keep quiet about it. When I left the office, the pawn was waiting just out the door and looked smugly at me before entering the office. It was the last time anyone saw her. She didn't even show up that afternoon. It was her first day, and she managed to get fired on the spot after just half a day of work, just because she wanted to feel respected. Good riddance, I say.